Hello and welcome to the Global Gaming Business Podcast, the industry's first and longest running podcast, now in our 19th year. As always, I'm your host Jess Marquez, and our guest today is Brett Abarbanel, Executive Director of the International Gaming Institute at UNLV, to talk about her journey into the academic side of gaming, the vision for the IGI, and her interest in the rise of esports and video games.
This podcast is sponsored by IGB Live, the home of the iGaming community, July 16th through 19th at the Rye, Amsterdam. For more information, visit IGBLive.com.
UNLV's International Gaming Institute is America's premier gaming research hub, led by Executive Director Brett Abarbanel. Since its inception, the IGI has been instrumental in fostering innovation, developing executive talent, and advancing regulation across the industry. Having been at the school in various roles for more than a decade, Abarbanel is a leading figure when it comes to gaming research, policy, responsible gaming, and other high-level topics. She and I spoke via Zoom in May. Brett, thank you so much for joining me on this beautiful Thursday morning. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you doing, Jess?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's a little bit gloomy outside, unfortunately. That's kind of usually how it goes. It's like really gloomy up until 1 p.m. and then it's like all of a sudden there's no clouds in the sky. So it's hard to really gauge like what kind of day,
Mm,
you know. Although is it as sunny as your background would pertain it to be in Vegas?
It absolutely is.
That's great.
We
That's
don't
great.
really get June gloom the same way Southern California does, and apparently you're getting it a little bit early this year.
Well, I mean, I ever since I moved here 2 years ago, I feel like I've been the gloom bearer because we've got nothing but like rain. You know, we've had all these like record storms and hurricanes and rainfall and things like that. So I'll attribute that to me, but I'll take the blame for that one. But you know, I hope it doesn't go on too much longer. But
Yeah, well, Southern California, I'm sure thanks you for that, interrupting their just nonstop onslaught of beautiful days. But you are in the standard June gloom time now. And I remember when I lived in Southern California, I mean, this was like uproar, right? Every time it would start because it would stay gloomy, like you said, till 1 p.m. And everyone would be so mad because they moved there for the beautiful sun and the beach. And how dare it be gloomy?
oh, all that tax revenue couldn't change the weather. Um, so anyway, I'm so thankful to have you on today. You're such a big presence in our gaming community, and also I feel like you are like one of those people who has like an unassailable like approval rating. Like I had never
Wow.
heard like I feel like every time there's certain people where it's like they're very polarizing. You hear kind of comments this way and that way, but I feel like you're one of those people who like you just say the name Brett and people are like just start abounding with praise and such. So again, it's really great to have you on, and thanks for taking the time.
Well, thanks, Jess. I am extremely flattered, and now I'm wondering what sort of antics I can get up to start messing with people's reputational views.
Well, we still have some time, obviously. So
Oh,
maybe,
yeah.
I'll try to lure you into, and then I'll spin it off, I'll spin it off. You'll see headline tomorrow like UNLV UNLV director, and then colon. Those are the worst articles where it's like just a
Oh,
colon
gosh.
and then the quote. So you'll see one of those tomorrow. Don't worry. Um,
Very clever. In my head, I'm like, oh, maybe I'll just start walking around with a big knife like Crocodile Dundee, and that will really do the trick. But your way
no,
is much better.
no kidding. No kidding. There will be a hit piece. Mark my words. Um, so anyway, so we'll get into obviously a lot of stuff pertaining to UNLV, gaming issues writ large and such like that. But I'm really interested, and we talked a little bit about this when we were in New York for SBC. But I'm interested to kind of get some of like just your background and your story. It's the academic side of gaming is very small, obviously, and it's a very niche community. So I'm kind of, I'm always fascinated to see how people kind of come to that world. And one thing about your background that I was interested in that you told me was like, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you kind of came into the industry through racing, through horse racing, which is equally interesting to me because that's like the most niche part maybe of the entire industry. So it's not like, you're not like one of these like MIT card counters or, like any or like a dice or anything like that. It's horse racing, which I feel like is even more interesting. So tell me about that and kind of how that led to obviously your life now.
Yeah, I would be happy to. It's so funny to hear racing be described as niche these days because in some ways this is one of the most long-standing legalized forms of gambling. It certainly in the Americas.
Sure.
Maybe we'll throw Highlight in there as well. And but racing has kind of stuck a little bit more even to
Yep.
today. But yeah, I grew up. I grew up in Southern California, real down the street from a racetrack, and for many years of my life, it was just a place that generated a lot of traffic, especially in summer, which was extra annoying because the beach already generated a lot of traffic.
Sure. Sure.
Uh,
I can attest.
Yes, yes. My spoiled upbringing of being near the beach, I will never forget. It is so wonderful. And as much as I love Las Vegas, I still think about it to today, how great it was when you could open your window and be like, ah, beautiful. But yeah, so I grew up near a track, and it wasn't really until I left Southern California to go to college. I went to school in New England, and I ended up majoring in statistics that I got that much more interested in what the track had going on. It was a really interesting place. So it was near Del Mar, which is where the surf meets the turf. So this was not only a beautiful place to visit, but also just this fascinating industry that I'd never really tapped into. I grew up being like an outdoor kid who ran around and played soccer all the time. And this was a place where I could get up at, 3, 4 in the morning and go watch the horses work out. And in Del Mar, what's really neat is the track is really right next to the water. So there were even trainers who would take the horses over to the beach. The closest beach is Dog Beach, so animals are indeed allowed, and take them over. And the salt water would be great for a lot of them with regard to like working on their muscles and exercise in the sand and that kind of thing. And when I started studying statistics, I was like, oh, there's this whole other part of racing, right? This, in many ways, betting bolsters and helps the racing industry simply exist in the first place. So I I worked there during multiple summers in college, and for my senior thesis, I ended up writing a paper about predicting the results of horse races. Um, as you can see, I'm not retired on a yacht right now, so it was not a very good model that I had built, but it was good enough. I made a teeny bit of money. I think I made like $200 or something like that off of my brilliant model that I no longer use. I remember I was incredibly lucky when I was working the summer after I had finished my undergrad. I got a chance to meet some of the all-time greats in horse racing, especially on the betting side. So folks like Andy Beyer and Steve Davidowitz, and I had a chance to kind of show them what I was doing. They pointed out all sorts of flaws. They were completely correct, by the way, when pointing out these flaws. But it was really neat to be able to bounce ideas off of these just icons in that industry. And I really got a chance to see how the work I was doing in school could be used in reality, and doing research work that then could be applied in real life. And so this started really kind of deviated away from the business of the thing and into the gambling of the thing, the activity itself. And around that same time, it was really right as the major poker boom of the early 2000s was happening. So in addition to all my, exciting adventures on the backside of the racetrack and in the press box, I also got a chance to learn more about gambling through poker. I had a friend who found out that I was majoring in statistics, and he said, at the time, wow, you're doing statistics and you're a woman. I got a table full of men who will probably get super distracted. Can I bankroll you in my poker game? And I was like, yeah, here's another neat way to apply everything I've learned in school. So he mostly bankrolled me. At some point, I was able to bankroll myself. And then I also had a part-time job as a math grader. So I worked for the math department when I was an undergrad. I was paid $8 an hour to professors would give me the homeworks. Sometimes they would give me the answer key. Sometimes I wrote it myself, and then I would grade the math homeworks. And like I said, I was paid $8 an hour, and essentially that was the other half of my bankroll that then ended up paying for things like groceries and that kind of thing. So that's where I was around age 21, kind of tipping into 22, I guess, at that point. ended up heading to Las Vegas shortly after that. I was at the time dating a guy, and I know this is like the worst parental advice. I'm sure my parents were appalled when I was like, "Oh, I'm going to go with my boyfriend to Las Vegas." Um, but the good news is we're married, and he is actually in my house right now on the other side of that door, keeping our dog occupied so she doesn't bark really loudly while you and I chat. So good news, it worked out. We came here. He was playing poker. I played a little poker, but mainly I was looking for jobs. And I found UNLV. I found Bo Bernhard, who was at the time, I think newly or somewhat newly appointed director of research for the International Gaming Institute at UNLV. And he hates the rest of the story because the way I found him was in the now defunct 944 magazine. This was before he learned you're allowed to tell photographers, no, I think that will make me look stupid. So we have they're wonderful, these amazing pictures of Bo, like in a car with dice in the window and like on his back on a blackjack table. They're wonderful. They're such wonderful glamour shots. And that's the part of the story he hates, but that's how I found him. And I said, look, I just finished school. I majored in statistics. This is a really interesting space for me. What do you guys have going on here? And I ended up working on some research projects that IGI had. Luckily, this was before the Great Recession of the late 2000s, so there were quite a few graduate assistantship positions open. So I ended up getting my degree while I was there. I went through my master's and my PhD, and everything that I had learned in terms of making sure your work is applied, what I'd learned from the track, what I'd learned from poker, and then what I learned heading into Las Vegas was really heavily emphasized at IGI from the get-go. So all the work that I was doing, all the work I'd like to think that I've done since, has always had some element of an applied nature to it. I always like to make sure that the work that I'm doing ties into, some sort of useful space. The other major influence in that space, I would be remiss not to mention him, is my father. My father was a theoretical physicist who actually wasn't really allowed in a lot of labs because he was kind of a klutz and broke lots of stuff, and it cost a lot of money when he would do that. But he loved to make sure his work had applied nature, and that was something he also taught me from a very young age. And so here, now into my current job, I've played many roles at IGI. I was a graduate assistant. I was a staff researcher. I left. I worked at UCLA for several years. And when I came back in 2016, I was the director of research. And then I took on this executive director position in January of last year. So it's been almost a year and a half now.
So I want to get to that part of it in just a second, but I just want to say that it's so interesting to me that you talk about the time in the poker, the online poker time, because as someone who's obviously been in the industry for a very short amount of time, there's two periods where I'm like regretful that I wish I would have been around for, and the first was the lead up to PASPA and the kind of the introduction of that in 2018. I feel like that was obviously a very interesting time, but the other was the early 2000s poker time, and it's something that is brought up pretty frequently, like when I talk to people around the industry, as like being like it's oft referred to as like the good old days, like people are like, man, that was just like a crazy time, and they like reflect back on it fondly. It maybe not at the time, obviously, with everything that happened, but it's just interesting to me to hear, because it does seem like that was such an influential time in the industry where you had a lot of these people who are now in leadership positions, or have since gone on to like become really big figures in the industry, who were like kind of budding in that time. It's interesting. It's like it's like the 60s for gaming almost. You know what I mean? It's like,
I love that. I love that analogy. That's such a great kind of comparison. It really was a formative time on so many different fronts, right? I totally agree. There are some people now in massive leadership roles in this industry who cut their teeth on poker, and this whole phase was this is what happens when you have the perfect storm of innovation, of tech innovation,
Sure,
and
exactly.
and then also regulation just having no idea what this is, right? Like I'll use the UK as an example. They wrote when they wrote the Gambling Act in 2005. Almost immediately, this thing was out of date because of the way the internet was so quickly evolving in our lives and the way we were accessing this. And then beyond that, even too, is the poker players themselves. Many of the famous pros from the heyday of poker are still around, and many of them still play poker. But they've also really been a big core of some of the other developments in our industry, right? Like daily fantasy sports,
Yep.
huge contributions to not just players, but also like major leaders, like you said, right? So John Aguiar, for example, huge poker player in the heyday of poker, has been part of DraftKings for, gosh, almost since its inception, and now still is continued to be a leader in that business as well. Then when we expand more broadly into sports betting, same thing, right? I mean, I remember some of the at least my early World Series of Poker. I'm not going to say the early World Series of Poker. That would be misleading. Where, for example, the World Cup would be on and everyone would be clamoring because they need to make sure they can see it from wherever their seat is in the Rio and the different views that they could have. So lots of really interesting moments that clearly helps drive the world that we live in today.
Definitely. Um, so kind of getting back to the UNLV timeline, and you mentioned obviously just now that you're about a year and a half into your tenure as executive director of the IGI. One thing I'm always interested in when talking to people who have like risen through the ranks at like one place is now like the difference between like when you were a like lower in levels versus now that you're like the person in charge. What has been kind of like I don't want to mean like in a negative way, but like what are some of the things like the unexpected challenges that you just had like no idea of? Like, because obviously you were a director of research for several years before, right? So like you were what it was like 5 or 6 years, correct?
I think it's about six. Yeah.
So you go from that tenure into now the lead role, and obviously things change and you have much different priorities and kind of scope of things. So kind of what have been some of like the things that you didn't realize about the role before that like are now like a big part of your scope?
So I would say the biggest challenge, I won't say, it's not that I didn't expect it, but more that I knew it was going to be present. I just didn't know what it would look like,
Sure.
is stakeholder management.
Sure.
I definitely felt aware of what that would look like externally
Mm,
because, IGI is a really walls outward institute. Huge chunks of what we do are not even on campus, right? They're outside the walls of academe. They're whether it's doing research that has an applied nature or working with local high schools on hospitality and tourism career development or the weird humble brag that's about to come, right? Traveling around the world to talk to different industry and regulators in different parts of the world to talk about kind of what do we know from the different pieces of work we've done. The external element of it, I was really ready and prepared for. I'm very pleased to say. It was the internal stakeholder management that I just really had to learn. And it was really valuable to be able to learn those lessons rather than just have someone say, hey, this is going to happen. So this is everything from, working with our own division. We exist within the Division of Research at UNLV. So research, of course, is a very heavy part of what we do, to working with other colleges, other departments. For anyone who's listening who's not familiar with a university atmosphere, it's almost like a small city. You have different departments who may never talk to one another, and it's like living in a completely different neighborhood. And IGI, as an institute that's not attached to a specific discipline or department, gets to work with all of them. So that's what I mean by this kind of stakeholder engagement is working with groups like the engineering college and the hospitality college and the psychology department, all these different and more. All these different groups have really different interests. They have different kind of disciplinary norms, even down to like citation style. If you're going to cite research work, you have to do it this specific way. And it's a completely different way from the way you'll do it in a different department. When it comes to authorship for research articles, in some departments, if you're the first author, you're the most important. Well, in other disciplines, if you're the last author, you're the most important. And then there's all sorts of different kind of bureaucratic and administrative needs that need to be learned, to a point where I think I finally have a grasp, not going to say firm grasp, that might be a little cocky, but a grasp of kind of the institutional knowledge that one needs to be a leader in that institution. And it's really been great to be able to now capitalize on that and have so many, learn so much more about all the interesting people who work in this, microcosm of a city that is UNLV, so that we can keep doing really interesting stuff with people from all across these different areas.
IGB Live is the industry's favorite iGaming show, home to over 9,000 of the world's most influential and pioneering iGaming professionals. There is just no better place to connect with the entire iGaming ecosystem if you are looking to meet iGaming operators, affiliates, suppliers, and game developers. IGB Live is the place you need to be. Join us for the last ever IGB Live in Amsterdam before we move to London. For more information, visit igblive.com.
It's funny, you mentioned citations and my brain I had like a PTSD flashback of like back to my undergrad days, which was like something, talk about something you haven't heard about in like 5+ years, that it's all it takes is one mention to like bring you back to like a world. I feel like I just woke up in like a cold sweat. But one thing about your job that's interesting to me, and we kind of mentioned this when we talked off air, but like I would imagine that in your case, one of the unique challenges about your case specifically is like you are kind of relatively alone. Well, maybe not alone per se, but there's not exactly a ton of these programs around the country. It's not like you are like the dean of like an engineering college where there's like 200 or 2,000 of your colleagues around the country that, like there's very few. So kind of, is that like, would you say that's like a challenge, or do you look at that more of like an opportunity to really like be innovative and kind of like set your own path and so on and so forth? Like there's really not that many programs, especially on your guys' scale, even not only just in the US, but around the world even.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you. We take that as a compliment,
Sure.
that we are. Can I go with unique instead of alone? Alone
Sure,
is
yeah.
sad, but unique feels cool, right?
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely.
You're right. I think it's both. There are definitely pros and cons to being who we are. We do have the benefit of getting to work with different, focus on academic institutions for now, different universities and other academic institutions all over the world. There aren't very many that really look at gambling in the holistic way that we do. There's a lot that focus, for example, on problem gambling, or a lot that focus on kind of psychology or public health, and that lab or organization or whatever, however it's described. Universities just, they tell you what you can name things and you name it that. That's the way it goes. You typically live within a specific department or college, so therefore it tends to have that particular focus. So for example, at UNLV, we have the Behavioral Addictions Lab. That's in our psychology department. It's run by my really awesome colleague, Shane Krause. And Shane and the lab also do work with IGI on specifically in areas of problem gambling. There are a couple of academics who are, like a one-person shop or maybe a smaller shop in particular areas, say like economics. There are a couple of groups internationally that have this broader focus like we do, whether that's everything from kind of the behavioral analysis to business analysis and the broader commercial implications of gambling. Mainly in Macau, which makes sense. We have some great sister organizations in Macau, in groups like University of Macau and Macau Polytechnic, which have some fantastic researchers and folks who work also, again, outside the walls of academia. They have people who work with the industry as well as work with regulation. Davis Fong, for example, at University of Macau, has held government positions. So there's definitely a relationship similar to what we do at IGI with those sorts of organizations. But you're right, it also can be a challenge. Sometimes when we get a really neat project, it can be a struggle to find the right folks to work on that project. We're very lucky that we do have a network that we've cultivated over many years to be able to reach out and put together a really useful and thoughtful group of people for different projects. But it absolutely can be a challenge. On the flip side of that, I'm just going to keep talking about pros and cons until,
Sure,
Brett, that's great. Let's
sure.
move on. But it is really neat to be able to have that wide variety of expertise across the world and be able to see all the different things that people are doing. And then back at our hub at IGI, say, this is really great. We want to do all of it.
Well, and it really makes sense when you just look at it from the broadest perspective possible, in the sense that obviously Las Vegas, the gambling capital of the Western world, and Macau, the gambling capital of the Eastern world. It kind of makes sense that those would be the two kind of pillars of the academic side, and or that side of the world. It makes sense from that perspective. Um, the next question actually is not from me. It's submitted by our friend or publisher, Roger Gross, who says, Shannon Bybee was a good friend of his and his actually former boss at Golden Nugget, Atlantic City, way back in the day. Talk about things that I was not, present for in the industry. That's one of them. You can add that to the list. But he says, obviously, for those who don't know, Bybee was an instrumental figure for the IGI. I believe he the first executive director or something.
Mhm.
Yeah, I believe so. The first executive director. At this stage in time, as the years have gone on, and now obviously looking towards the future with you at the helm, how do you think that the institute is kind of carrying on his vision, and like looking ahead? Do you think that that's like does the when it I guess what I'm asking is, like, when it was first formed versus now that we're here in this industry with all the changes that have kind of gone through the years, do you think that the mission still remains the same?
So, you talked about phases of this world that you wish you'd been around for.
Sure,
I wish I'd been around for the Bybee era.
sure.
He unfortunately passed well before his time, and it was a few years before I landed in Las Vegas and found the International Gaming Institute, and it became a huge part of my life. uh, but Shannon was just this formative figure for everything, not just at IGI, but across the industry and across everything that the industry touches. So that includes everything from, thoughtful contributions to policy and really helping shape the foundation for the way that the industry can be part of helping those who suffer from problem gambling. Right, he played a major role in the Nevada Council, as well as I think the National Council on Problem Gambling as well. And this is really well timed. I don't know when this will air, but you and I are talking on the day of the annual Nevada Council for Problem Gambling conference. So again, Shannon's influence was just so incredibly massive, and the goal of IGI has really largely stayed the same since his leadership, and I like to think that we are continuing that to this day. He was really insightful in the sense of creating a place that would continue to study the area of gambling as it touched on these very important areas. And one of the things that has become quite popular in gambling research as a whole these days is a pretty big focus on a lot of the negatives that are associated with the industry. And one of the things that we've always tried to maintain is a really balanced look at all of this, because gambling's not inherently positive, it's not inherently negative. It is, right? It's something that we do as human beings, this risk-taking activity. And when Shannon passed, there was a lot said about him. Of course, he was this incredible human being who, like we said, right, it had such a huge impact on the space. But in particular, was a quote, and I might botch it slightly, hopefully I won't, from Carol Harder, who was at the time the president of UNLV, who said that Shannon's compassion was equal to his integrity. And that's a huge part of the way that I like to lead, as well as the way that I hope IGI as a whole leads, in the sense that we want to make sure that we're emphasizing the positive, we're emphasizing the negative, and we're emphasizing everything that exists in between too. while at the same time, again, that compassion is really important. If there is a negative element, let's make sure that we are well aware of that and emphasizing it. And if there is a positive element, let's celebrate that. Part of compassion means celebrating the wins as well. And that's something that we really try to do. Of course, IGI doesn't look exactly the same as it did when Shannon ran it, but that's a good thing, right? In the sense that
Sure.
the gambling world itself has evolved. So we've really tried to maintain a lot of those core values, our core mission. And then, of course, as the thing, gambling and the broader gambling industry has evolved, so have we. So this includes different areas that didn't even exist, right? Online gambling was barely a thing at the time. And now, of course, that's a huge part of what we study. Many of the current properties that populate the strip, which is just a few blocks away from our offices, well, those weren't there when IGI was built, when the building we're in was built. And so we've expanded our remit, of course, into these bigger integrated resort spaces too. So a lot of what we do now is I like to think of it as I've used evolution a few times, but that's really what it is, the evolution of these original core ideas, many of which Shannon championed.
I think that's really well said, and I think that puts the things in very good perspective. And I really like the way that you said that from a philosophical level of like gambling is not inherently positive or negative; it just is. I think that's really well said, and I think that really highlights kind of like you said the changes at the IGI. I will say that as a native Nevadan, I am obligated. It is in the state constitution that I have to say that gambling is great and there are no problems. So I need to. I'm just, I'm just kidding. No, like I said. That was great. That was really well said, and I think
Well, we're definitely battle born, so I'll
that's
certainly
that.
get behind that.
That's definitely true, and I think he would definitely. I think he is certainly proud to see how the institute looks today and how it's primed for the future.
Oh, I
Um,
would hope so.
the last theme I kind of want to touch on today is I want to get away from work a little bit because, you know, that's work, but I really want to get into the things that like interest you about the industry as a whole. And I understand that the kind of video game esports side of thing is really interesting to you, and that's like really fascinating to me because that is another side of the industry that's like really kind of in its infancy, and kind of feel like people don't really know like what to do about it. There's kind of like a lot of conversations that are mostly theoretical, hypothetical. It's still I don't know if a lot of people really understand how it's going to fit into like the framework of the industry at large, if it will, what it will look like. So I'm really interested to just kind of just like to just go on that and just kind of seeing like what about that side of things interests you, and kind of what are some things that really stand out in the current in that current space.
Well, this is very kind of you because to tell an academic, hey, free reign, just start talking about this thing you love.
Sure.
First of all, that's a very foolish thing to do, but I'll forgive you for that. And I promise not even to talk forever about it. But yes, absolutely. Games and esports, I love this subject. It's one of my pets, if you will.
Mhm.
And it's a pet that I love to share with everybody else. This is not just a Brett thing. This is something that everybody should think is really fascinating. Even if you're not a gamer, rather, even if you don't participate in it yourself, it's a really interesting phenomenon that has just spread across a lot of the way that humans consume entertainment, because a lot of the ways that games have been consumed for a long time, and especially as we kind of hit COVID and saw so much of everything move online, we had such a heavy emphasis on streaming, which it had a huge presence for gaming already for years, going back, not just with Twitch, but Twitch's predecessor, Justin TV, which I'll admit my age, I totally watched. Um, these are things that have been kind of a core part of, like I said, entertainment consumption. And it has a huge overlap with gambling, but this isn't, this Venn diagram isn't a circle, to kind of put it that way. There's a lot of parts of games that are not esports and that are not gambling. There's a lot of parts of esports that are games that are gambling. And, I could say this for all the different potential combinations of these three items, but, in the interest of time. Um, and so it becomes an area where we have this pretty convoluted space. It is an evolution. Again, this evolution just keeps popping up. Evolution of the way that we play games, that we watch games. And and then of course when we bring it into the gambling space, it gets even more complex because we have to start talking about what things look like from a legal perspective, which of course is, that to speak to another leader in this field, Bill Eadington, who I can't believe it's been 11 years actually since he passed. But, if Shannon was one of those original leaders who helped really shape the space that is the gambling industry, Bill really was the father of gambling as an academic pursuit. He led the program at UNR for many, many, many years. And many of the things actually that IGI does, we inherited from Bill when he passed. And he used to talk about how gambling it really exists in many ways at the whims of the regulators and of the legislators because they really dictate the way this legal space exists. And of course, without it, we still have plenty of illegal space. But because of that, that means that suddenly anything that is games and esports that kind of trickles into the gambling space really is, and probably rightfully so, subject to the same sort of scrutiny that the legal gambling world is also subjected to. And this can get hairy, it can get gray, it can get confusing. It definitely, raises a lot of eyebrows, and both in terms of, oh, what is this thing, as well as, oh, I'm not touching that, right? I'm really interested, but that is, attractive to kids, and therefore it's not going to be part of my gambling offering or my casino mix, whatever it is that you have in your business. And so this includes everything from, the way that we incorporate different chance elements in games. This is nothing new. Games have had chance pieces for a long time, right? I mean, look at, for example, with a board game, when you roll a die, that's a chance element that's in a game. It's probably not gambling unless you're betting on the outcome of the board game, but it is definitely an element of chance, an element of uncertainty. And that has spilled very much into video games as well. So then we have games, some of which incorporate chance, that become spectator sport. That's when we're getting into the esports space. So you may have something that people are competing on that has chance involved. So maybe that starts trickling into definitions of gambling. And then maybe you can bet on those competitions. That has, of course, elements of gambling. And that's not even starting to get into some of the more casual consumption of many of these different things, the way that different skill-based games look, the way that gambling games start bringing in a lot of the gamification practices of a lot of traditional games that we've been used to. And now, so all of a sudden, all of these words are starting to get conflated, even in just the last, couple minutes of what I've said. So there's a lot of different ways that this gets convoluted real quickly, and it becomes very difficult to unpack from a regulatory perspective, from a commercial perspective. And then one of the great things about being an academic is that that can be part of your job. You started this question out, right? Saying, oh, well, enough about the work stuff. Let's talk about other interests as well. It is like this great joy for me to be able to work in games and esports in addition to this overlap with the gambling space, because that means I get to play games and it's a learning experience and it's work. I have to know how these games work because that's part of what I do for my job. So I really love this. What's that probably terrible quote that if you love what you do, you don't have to work a day in your life, something like that. Which is not healthy. You shouldn't take all your, you shouldn't be working all the time. That's what I mean by terrible. But it is really joyous sometimes to work in this space, to work in the broader gambling, gaming industry, and be able to explore the really interesting ways that we have innovated this space over time.
Well, and I think the thing that I was thinking of when you were saying that is like it kind of ties back to the previous philosophical thing that we just mentioned was like gambling just is, and I think kind of tying into that almost is like gambling. We've seen over time that gambling kind of is like it fills the available space, right? Or it like seeps, whatever like chemistry metaphor you want to use. Like it's like it fills the available space. It trickles into everything. Like I think the fascinating thing to me with the video game esports side of it is like it really does kind of make us go back to what is the fundamental definition of like chance and risk, and when does it become gambling versus just like you said, like a board game. Obviously, most people would say that's not gambling, but there still has element of placing a bet and so on and so forth and rolling a die. Um, I think what I think in the future is like when regards to gambling, or at least in the regulated industry as we know it, is like it feels like a lot of other things in society where it's like you're always kind of in a reactive state rather than a proactive state. So like things will happen and then you react to them. Um, what would you say is like the most I guess I would say like the most important things, or like from like an academic perspective or a research perspective, like what do you think needs to kind of be on, whether it be the mind of regulators, legislators, like what do you think we need to kind of be monitoring with this evolution? There it is again, with regards to like the gaming space, because I think we know by now, obviously, as we've seen with all other forms of gambling, that it is already there. Like we know that it's there, we know it exists, so we might as well go into it headlong and like try to tackle what are the issues of it. So what would you say is kind of like the important factors in that space that we need to kind of monitor now before we're in a state that we're usually in, whereas we're reacting to the bad things and the press and the calls for all the things like that? Like, what do you think we should kind of try to get ahead of or have on our radar with regards to that space? Because that's the interesting piece of it to me.
Yeah. So specifically to kind of the oversight area, right? So the legislative, the regulatory, um, maybe on the enforcement side of this, as well as the regulatory or policy creation, is to be open to learning. And I
Sure.
don't want to undermine those. Plenty of regulators do this, and it's wonderful. But almost like an open door type policy to learn more about what this space looks like. I could probably identify 5 different things that we're going through right now, but again, they'll probably be out of date by
Yeah.
the time we hang up, right? And so, and this learning, the shameless plug, of course, on the IGI front, our subcenter, the International Center for Gaming Regulation, offers all sorts of different courses and resources to learn about different things. This also means learning from your licensees, learning from the industry, even the industry that's beyond the scope of your licensees. And I know this can be really tough from different conflict of interest perspectives, right? You can't just go to say an online site that's operating illegally and say, hey, tell me what you're doing because I want to learn more about what this looks like. You're probably going to get a door slammed in your face. And then there's going to be one of those headlines you described, right? Like, so-and-so gambling commission, : we
Yep.
screwed up, right? Something like that. You don't want that to happen. Um, but there's a huge amount that you can learn from the industry itself and the direction that it's going, the trials and tribulations that the industry itself has experienced through, for example, testing out different products, or whether, they have concerns about somebody placing huge wagers that might have a tie to, say, a famous athlete, to use a right real-time example. Trying to figure out what these sorts of things look like. There are ways to do, for example, closed door sessions so that you don't have IP issues. And I want to specifically mention, I'm not even going to touch the whole Massachusetts roundtable that just happened there, but more in terms of, for example, if you're doing some sort of product development or you're trying to figure out a new space, that there's also proactive outreach by the industry that can be done to regulators so that the regulators are aware of what's going on, of what this thing looks like. um, it's really important to be mindful that they have to regulate a pretty big industry that clearly is regularly changing, and so it's hard to stay on top of all those changes if they're not doing them themselves. And so I really always emphasize how important that kind of collaboration and communication is on that front. And so that's an area that we try to work in as well, right? We are an objective, neutral space at IGI. This is a place where you can come and ask those weird questions that you might think someone will laugh at you, and another we won't laugh at you. We think questions are interesting, uh, and so on that front, I would say it's really about gosh, as corny as it is, it's about the education and
Sure.
making sure that you have the resources and that you're compiling those resources, right? You're doing the outreach that you need to learn so that there hopefully will be fewer times that everybody's caught unawares by huge scandal.
Well, it's definitely necessary. I think that's the perfect way to put it. It's definitely necessary work, especially because, as we know, things always keep, as you just said, things always are changing, and the gambling part of it is going to go along with that, whether people think that it is or not, or whether they want it to or not, it will. So,
Mhm.
having that research as a backdrop and that education to try to make it a as best of a reality as it can be, I think is definitely a necessary undertaking and one that is not easy by any means, obviously, but that's why we need smart people in closed, we need smart people doing things at odd hours of the day and night and locking themselves into, extremely long research sessions and things that, are unseen by any other people. That's usually where the best work comes from, as what I've seen. Um, Brett, that's all I had for you today. I thank you so much for your time and for sharing all this beautiful information with us. I do have to say, speaking of my list of obligations, it pains me so deeply to have such a great conversation with someone at UNLV. Go Wolfpack, UNR grad. But I have to concede, obviously, you guys are obviously, I cannot, get past the fact that you guys are the leader in the gaming space. I will concede you that front always. But again, thank you so much. What are some things? Do you have anything coming up? I know obviously you have the Nevada problem gambling, which is today, but in the near future, anything that you have on your radar that you have planned?
Yes. Oh, and this is killing two birds with one stone. I am so excited that you
Sure.
totally attacked us because go Rebels. But
Yeah,
we actually have one of the longest running collaborative efforts between UNR and UNLV
sure.
in the form of an upcoming thing, which
Nice.
is the executive development program that we run every year. It's one of the things that we inherited from UNR and that we continue to run with UNR. This is a program, it's at the end, or excuse me, the beginning of November.
Okay.
We hold it prior to US Thanksgiving. But this is, in essence, an 8-day boot camp. We hold it in Lake Tahoe. And it is for anybody who works in the gambling world who's at, say, like a VP, director type position, who wants to be in the C-suite. So it's very high gaming industry specific leadership education. We change the syllabus every single year because the key issues change regularly, while some of course stay the same. And the goal of this is to really prepare and build the future of this industry and make sure that we have really good, really well prepared people running it. This is something where we get people from all over the world. It is capped at 60 or 65. I think we just upped it last year. And officially, as of last year, it sells out early. Last year, we sold out a month ahead of time. So please get your applications in. There's information on our website. There's information from UNR through the Executive Education Program and the Gaming Management Program there. We love to see really interesting people, and we'd love to have you join our EDP alumni network, which is also quite extensive all over the world. Then we also have a few other programs, but that really is, I think, the biggest one coming up, and also the biggest one that, of course, ties into the collaborative, positive elements of having these two huge, productive universities in our state.
That's beautiful. And who said, use this interview as proof. Who says that two rivals cannot have a informative and collaborative conversation? Um, Thank you again, Brett. Again, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you got a busy schedule, so I'll let you go. But thanks again, and hope to talk to you soon.
Hope you enjoyed this week's podcast, sponsored by IGB Live, the home of the iGaming community, July 16th through 19th at RAI Amsterdam. For more information, visit IGBLive.com. To learn more about the topics we discussed today, visit ggbmagazine.com. Subscribe to GGB News to get all the news of the gaming industry delivered to your desktop every Monday morning. Sign up at ggbnews.com and use the coupon code GGB180 for a free subscription. Don't miss a single episode of the podcast. Subscribe on Amazon, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify today. So we'll see you next time on the GGB podcast.